So we're continuing our series on how is God present in the world, looking at different models theologians have thought about for hundreds of years. Last week we looked at the deist model, which is the idea that God creates the world, it's a decent system, God steps away and lets it run, like the watchmaker makes a watch, lets it run. We talked about the problems with that the biblical model seems to show God getting interested, getting involved in the story, and watches run down, and sometimes they break. What is that? How did that work then? So today we're going to look at the Neo-Thomist model from Thomas Aquinas. So drawing on the insights of Thomas Aquinas, big Catholic theologian, concerning causality, it kind of finds its expression in his book, The 5 Ways of Proving God. His later followers, his students, developed the idea of a complex network of primary and secondary causes. This approach avoids the absentee God difficulty of deism by insisting upon the continuing presence and activity of God within creation. However, this action is seen as subtle, resting upon the idea of God as a primary cause and natural agencies as secondary causes. God, according to this view, both creates these secondary causes in the first place and then subsequently works through them. So we'll get a little bit more into what is a primary cause, what is a secondary cause. But think of it this way. Like a secondary cause might be, like if you're a wonderful musician and you play the violin, you're the primary cause of the music, the violin's the secondary cause. If the violin is faulty, as good as a musician you are, it's still not going to produce a perfect sound. So imagine if you're a musician, you made your violin, then you made your secondary cause that the music comes through. So if it's imperfect, it's your own fault because you made a faulty violin. Does that make sense? The musician will be the primary cause of the music, but uses an instrument, the secondary cause, to make the music. So each secondary cause, such as a human being, a natural force, has a particular characteristic or inclination, reflecting its distinctive identity and place within creation. God works through these secondary causes as a joiner works through his saw or a musician through her violin. Although God can work without the need of secondary causes in the case of miracles, the normal pattern of divine activity is through these secondary causes. Hence, a woman who loves her son could be said to express the love of God, and that God is the primary cause of love. Nevertheless, the reality and the distinctiveness of that secondary cause are maintained. Even though God is implicated in that love, it remains the woman's love for her son. So basically, all love is God's love, right? God is love. God is the source of love. So if I love my daughter, it's my love for my daughter, but the reason I have that love is God. So God's the primary cause of the love, I'm the secondary cause, and it's both God's love and my love that gets sent on. Does that make sense? Another way to kind of think of it, like the moon has no light of its own. It used to be thought you had the primary light, the secondary light. But really, what is moonlight? Sunlight, which is why I never understood why vampires didn't crumble to dust when they're out on a full moon, right? Because the light from the moon should, no one ever thinks about that though. Wrap your mind around it. So, the primary, if we're out at night and we have light by the moon by which to see, the primary cause of that light is the sun. The moon reflecting it is a secondary cause, but it doesn't have its own light in that situation. Like when we're driving a car at night, we have the reflectors on the road. We have the car as the primary light. The reflectors reflect that light, and they're still helpful to help see. So often we are reflecting the light of God, the love of God. We are secondary causes. So then we get to this fun thing that I call the web. This method of seeing of how God's active in the world, primary, secondary causes, utilizes a web of cause and effects. It's like the old show Joan of Arcadia that Marie preached on a few weeks ago. God, in some form, suggests something to Joan, a teenage girl, who makes a decision which impacts a boy, who does something else, which helps a girl, and it goes on and on. God is the primary cause, but works through all these secondary causes, us, and yet we still have the choice whether to be used by God and to obey or not. So the example I gave this morning at the 8 o'clock service, I'll use again. Let's say somebody at the 10:30 service decides to give a full scholarship for a Pakistan student. Now we could say, well, one reason they did is because Nancy Reiner chose to do a video. So that would be one secondary cause. But why did Nancy choose to do a video? Well, somebody asked her, and so they had this idea of shares. That's from the Friends of PEB and all of them getting together. But what made them think of that and want to care for this? Well, there was a group that went to Sargoda a few years ago and how that was impactful. Why did they go to Sargoda in the first place? Well, we had a relationship because Debbie Hogue and others had been working with Friends of PEB for years. Well, why did they first care about this? Why do we have the Friends of PEB? And it goes back and back, all these cause and effects to somebody way back beginning, and you can decide from the beginning, say, I want to start a school for Christian missionaries and to give education. But why did they have that heart? Somebody gave them the faith, and so on and so forth. So you can have this long, complex web of cause and effects that lead eventually to somebody watching that video and saying, I'm going to give a scholarship to a student. Now, at any point, somebody might have chosen not to do something and could change the whole web of events. Or somebody might have chosen something, but somebody else might have then done it. Like if Nancy had said, I can't do the video, well, maybe Cindy might have, or Tom Davis, or somebody else. So we each have our own agency in that, but God can put something on our hearts, can nudge us, can open a door, and lead to so many different paths. We still have the choice whether we go through the door or not. So even in the Bible, you'll see sometimes God's kind of plans seem to work, and sometimes they don't, so God goes a different route. So in this web of causes, God's the primary cause for everything, but what eventually leads is all these natural choices, all these cause and effects that we're a part of. So it talks about in the Bible how, we can be used as instruments. We had that, prayer, make me an instrument of your peace. Or we say we are jars of clay with a treasure inside, that God chooses to use us. God doesn't have to use humans, but God chooses to. So we have the ability to spread the gospel and evangelize. We have the ability to give to charities and compassion. All these things we can do, but we can also not do. But then maybe somebody else steps through. So a lot of things that happen, you may often have things in your life where you realize, man, if this, and this hadn't happened, I wouldn't be able to do this. Or I wouldn't have become this. I wouldn't have had this opportunity. I'm sure we can each name several things in our life where we can kind of trace back and say, a series of cause and effect led us to this point. So that's how the Neo-Thomas model kind of sees God's activity. God is the primary actor, but most of the time is using us in the natural world to get to a particular end. And sometimes because we have free will, we can throw monkey wrenches into that, which leads us to the summary and analysis. So this approach respects the integrity and reality of natural causes, that we do have free will to make decisions, and there are cause and effects and consequences, good and bad, for everything we do. And also insists that we see the primary causality of God behind an apparently natural causality. Anything that happens in God's kind of the primary mover. However, this view, like many others, is confronted with the difficulties of this problem of evil we're looking at. If God is all good and all powerful, why do bad things happen? The suggestion that evil may be explained by a good primary cause, having to work through inadequate secondary causes, has an obvious attraction. Oh, the only reason bad things happen is because, God's perfect, but he's using imperfect people, and so, of course, the perfect's not going to go through. Like if you have a perfect piece of sound, but you put, a bunch of rubber and stuff in front of it, that sound's going to get distorted. If you have a beam of light and you put, a kind of faded glass in front of it, that light's going to not be perfect anymore when it goes through that. So that's how some people see evil. God's will is perfect, we mess it up. The thing that they then challenge with that is, who made the imperfect people to begin with? So whose fault is it? Like if you make a really bad guitar and then it doesn't sound good, even though you're a great guitar player, whose fault is it? Your fault making a bad guitar. So that's what they say, God chose to make imperfect people, so ultimately the origin of evil is God for creating faulty people. But then it goes back to, God wanted us to have free will because God prioritized a free relationship of love. Instead of this absolute perfect world, God wanted there to be freedom of love. That there was something real about it, because if it's forced, if it's required, if it's perfect, it's not really real. If no one has if you don't have a choice to say no, yes doesn't mean a thing, right? So God prioritized that. But then that's the question, well, is that the reason we have these bad things? Because God prioritized free will. These are all bigger questions that eventually we'll get to. But it shows some of the way the detractors say this model kind of eventually falls short is God creates the secondary causes. But what I enjoy about this model, like with any of them we've looked at, no one model explains everything perfectly. It's like we said a few weeks ago. It's like trying to understand a three-dimensional world through a two-dimensional object like a map. Each map distorts the world in some way, but when you can get several maps together, you can begin to understand what a three-dimensional world might look like. So this model helps us to see, well, yeah, maybe there is a web of cause and effect. It's not always God says this, this, and this, and it works. That God works through us. But we can hold that, but what other model can we look into and then also hold some of its truth as well? So we'll look at some other models of understanding how God is at work in the world next week and the week after. Maybe through all of them, we can kind of get a sense of what works for us, what you believe. Because again, smart people have thought all these things. So you have to kind of figure out what helps you understand best how God is at work in the world. And I do like the idea of thinking God has a plan, God has these good things, but God invites us into the process. And sometimes that works great, and sometimes we mess it up, but we get to be a part of the good things God has for the world, like Sargota scholarships, like helping with downtown daily bread, like saying a prayer for a friend, welcoming a stranger for a meal, sharing a nice word. All these things we do have larger ripple effects that maybe we don't even realize, but we are part of the web of how God is at work and how God is present in the world. Any questions? All right, I finished with 10 seconds early before my 11 minutes is up, so that works.